Okay, see, I'm going to.
So it is my honor and privilege to be able to introduce two amazing conversation starters to our Courageous Conversation series. So we have with us LaFontaine Oliver, and I'll let you share a little bit about your background because I don't think that your bios do either one of you all justice. We also have with us the Reverend Mark Thompson. I will tell you all that I'm smiling a little bit because I started my career around these amazing men, and I've seen the work they put in. So I'm really excited that you all have joined us, and I look forward to a very fruitful and thought-provoking conversation. So I wanted to start with the fact that you're both leaders and influencers in the media industry, right? Can you share a little bit about your background, like your journey, the trajectory of what you're doing now and where you came from, and anything that kind of happened in between the steps that you took to get to this place?
La, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. And I guess before I get started, thank you for inviting Mark and I. It's a pleasure to do this, and I'd be remiss if I did not congratulate you on taking the helm of this organization. And I know there's nothing but good things in store for you all. So I just wanted to congratulate you. So. Really quickly, my career trajectory, it really has been, I followed in the footsteps of my dad who, worked in radio, and it was, been my first love for as long as I can remember. Got my start in college radio, used that as a springboard, worked in commercial radio, briefly in the South Florida, Miami market, before returning back home to the Washington, D.C. area. Had the wonderful opportunity to work with the great folks at Radio 1, of course, the legendary Mrs. Kathy Hughes. My first commercial job back in the D.C. metropolitan area was, of course, with Radio 1's first station, WOL. Had an opportunity to work throughout that DC cluster of stations before working for Radio 1 Corporate, working for their satellite division, which helped to launch programming for XM Satellite, and then also their syndicated talk network, where I was able to help really launch a number of national shows. And during that stint, of course, is where I'm our esteemed panelists here, Reverend Mark Thompson, and from there, I made a transition into public media, and that brought me to Baltimore, and then I got recruited away back to Florida and spent 6 years in Orlando, Florida, running the NPR affiliate there. Before then, getting recruited back here to the area, and my current role is as president and general manager of WYPR in Baltimore, which is the market's flagship NPR news and information station. I also serve nationally on the NPR board. But I've been very, very fortunate, I think, in my career to work with some wonderful folks and to have, developed myself and to be able to move up into a space where, I'm now in a position where, I can, look back and help to create opportunities for the next generation of broadcasters. So.
Well, first of all, can you hear me okay, Tiffany? Well, first of all, it's so good to see you. It's been years. This is nostalgic for us all to be together. I don't know when we've had this opportunity, and I hope we'll get a chance to have it again. What my big brother, my elder brother LaFontaine, just described in terms of his career, and he is my elder brother. It's kind of, so I've been talent all of my career, talent, and it's not that I'm talented, but that's the term obviously we use in radio when you're on the air. And to hear what LaFontaine described, and it's so impressive, I have to say this. The It's kind of a sports analogy. You have football and baseball and basketball players, and that's talent. But we have still had the need to fight for people who look like us, Tiffany, in management. And so LaFontaine's career is very historic and very important, because some of us who are on the air can be pretty much a dime a dozen. I mean, there are Black people still in music and radio and all that kind of stuff. But to have had someone to be a general manager and a manager and all of that in radio is just about as rare as it is in the NFL and the NBA and MLB. So I don't want us to lose sight of, you know, how groundbreaking and how important his career has been, because when people like him and people who look like us are in management, they can hire people like me who are talent with little talent. So that's a good thing. But just in terms of my trajectory, of course, all of us come from Radio 1, and we want to lift up Ms. Hughes today, in that, you know, she lost her mother a couple of days ago. But I think she gave all of us our first break. Definitely gave me mine when I was just 22 years old. When my mother was a senior at Howard University, she gave birth to me in what was then Freedman's Hospital. So I was born in the building that is now named the Kathy Hughes School of Communications. So it's kind of interesting to work out that way, that she would give me my first job in radio. This is my, as young as I look, this is my 32nd year in terms of being in radio and being someone on that side of the microphone. I did news and talk hosting for years at Radio 1, and then talk hosted on Sirius XM. Because of LaFontaine, my show Make It Plain was the very first talk show to sound on XM. It was delayed because of 9/11 in 2001. And one day La said, "Hey man, come on in here. We need you to do something." I said, "What?" We knew we were going to launch at some point. He said, "No, we're going to do it right now. Let's just do it. We just want to do it. Let's go." And we literally went on the air with no subscribers. And for, I guess, a little over a year, LaFontaine, while we built up a subscriber base, I had to talk to myself, which is somewhat equivalent to being in prison and in solitary confinement. You know, it was a trip, but we did it. We got through it, and had a pretty lengthy career in satellite radio. Now I'm in the podcasting world, and that is going pretty well. But that's pretty much been my history, still talking about the important issues of the day from the perspective of our people, from the perspective of African-American people. And obviously there's a lot to talk about.
Thank you. You all both have had these illustrious careers, and kind of bringing it full circle to even understand like this series that we're launching. Courageous Conversations has been a series that was born out of the need to have this discussion with Black and brown people, to lift up these voices that, you know, I've always heard people say our voices were silenced, but we've never been silent. Our voices were deliberately unheard, right? So with that being said, we have this new reckoning in the world that's come about. There's this new space where people have been talking, there have been these racial uprisings. We've been talking about racial inequality. And a lot of people, I'm hearing people say that it sparked from the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. What I would be remiss to say is that this brutalization is nothing new. This has been going on for hundreds of years, so, of Black bodies. So what makes this moment different? And is this a watershed moment? And are there any specific ways that you're using your voice and platform to influence how this is seen and how we bring about change and influence in the media?
You want to keep the order, La? You want to go first, or?
No, you go ahead. I'll follow you this time.
Okay. This is a different moment in this respect. Well, let me first of all say, you're in PG County. and we cannot be ahistorical or forget where we come from. So for those in PG County, and we've been through this, who live in PG County, we remember Terrence Johnson, we remember Archie Elliott and others. This has always happened. This is nothing new, but it was largely ignored. And to be frank about it, I think it's a different type of moment, Tiffany, for this reason. Because of COVID. People being at home in this pandemic made them a captive audience in front of the television. And I'm sure LaFontaine will agree with me. And he probably like me. So we it's not like we don't know white people and we don't work with white people. Even white people who consider to be progressive and liberal, when this is where it started to me. When folk were forced to sit at home and see Ahmaud Arbery's killing on a loop, I don't know about you, La, but white folk I know started calling me and said, wait a minute, we ain't never seen nothing like this, Mark. What is, I was like, yeah, this is our lives. This happens all the time. And I literally, and these are folk who I, always consider to be progressive, but you could tell this was a line that they had not experienced having been crossed yet, like right there. Phone ringing off the hook. Oh my God, I can't believe this, and we can do something. And then right on the heels of that, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And so now you have, for the first time, more people who don't look like us, who are outraged about what they've seen. This has forced this reckoning. People have been forced to look in the mirror more than ever before. And see, a brother like LaFontaine is important because in the C-suites where he can move, people will call and say, well, LaFontaine, what do we do about this? That's why it's important to have people in positions like him. As far as what I do on the air, not much has changed because we always talked about these issues. But now we talk about the reckoning, and we also talk about mobilizing people to demand even more than before, because that's what you can do in a reckoning. You can go even further. And there have been a lot of interesting conversations. My vocation is being on air, but in ministry and in activism. I mean, even some of the off the record conversations that I've been having with different groups and organizations and corporations and major players and professional sports. What do? We have to do something, Mark. We have to, people are just really, you've never seen Major League Baseball. One person took a knee in the NFL. Opening day on Major League Baseball, everybody took a knee. The world has to be coming to an end whenever you see LaFontaine, a 300-foot Black Lives Matter sign out in front of Fenway Park. I mean, nobody ever thought they'd see something like that in Boston. So that lets you know that this is a very different moment. I just hope it doesn't fizzle out. I don't think that it will, because Trump kind of helps it. He's so stupid. He prolongs the moment by continuing to attack Black people, continuing to want to uphold Confederate statues, sending federal agents into communities to confront demonstrators. Just real quick, how we've come full circle in terms of history and how history repeats itself. The march from Selma to Montgomery was originally a Black Lives Matter march because the governor of Alabama at the time, George Wallace, who people accused Trump of always wanting to emulate, George Wallace banned and prohibited nighttime demonstrations for voting rights in Selma and in Alabama. And one night they had a march anyway. And they almost killed C.T. Vivian that night. The state troopers ended up killing Jimmy Lee Jackson. That's what brought everybody to Selma to march across that bridge. And so what is Trump doing? He is attacking people who are involved in nighttime demonstrations. It's no longer metaphorical. This is actually happening. And so that helps build a resistance and outrage, and what I think is this ongoing reckoning.
Yeah, so I'll just say I agree. I will think back to the words of Gil Scott-Heron, who said the revolution will not be televised, but I think if he were alive with us today, he might have to remix that and say that perhaps it will be, because I do think part of the the difference here was the captive audience, and not just on legacy broadcast, meaning, you know, seeing this on network television and cable television and hearing this on the radio, but the advent of the web and social media, and, you know, the fact that, you know, cell phone video and all of these things make these things so much more prevalent, that it almost forces us to deal with a reality that sometimes we can squirm away from when we don't have a constant loop of the video to show what's been happening. And so I think that is one of the things that has sort of made this different. And then to Mark's point, the other thing is, so sort of the flames of change have always really been lit by the young, but I think what we're seeing now is a young, multi-racial, multi-ethnic group of people who are now all coming together around something in a way that has been powerful, and I think has forced a lot of people to stand up and take notice. And I think that's the other reason that this feels different as well.
So Mark mentioned that you were concerned you didn't want this to just be this moment, and I've been saying that I think that this is a moment for some, but it should be a movement for many, right? How do we continue to? We know that this work has been, people have been doing this work for many, many years. And how do we continue to push this through? And how do we also develop clear strategies and suggestions? Because we know what we don't want, right? But what we don't often hear are strategies around what we would like to see. So we know that we want to not have racial inequities, but what does racial equity look like? And not just necessarily in making a statement. You know, we can have organizations that make a statement, but what do internal policies and external practices look like? Where is an investment of money and resources and time? And I take this back to the media standpoint. What's the role and responsibility of the media today? In LaFontaine, you kind of started talking about social media and what that looks like. I know that the media has always had a strong position, especially when it comes to addressing and showcasing racial inequities. So whether it was a photographer that was taking pictures of charred Black bodies swinging from trees, whether it was a newspaper that posted the photo of Emmett Till in a casket. And now we have people that are capturing video on their cell phones in real time and uploading it or sharing it live. What does this look like, one, in terms of partnership with people who are really, many journalists of sort without necessarily calling themselves such? What does that look like? And then where is the space for specifically for the Black press in the covering of our issues and still being given credit for covering our issues and not having other outside mainstream agencies kind of co-opting that story?
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think I'll start with saying from the media and more specifically the news media's standpoint, this is a call for all of us to really take seriously the sort of original charter behind what it really means to be in news and to be a journalist. And I will speak to it from that perspective because that's the space that I currently work in. And that means that, we also, as a part of this, have to confront some of the issues that have stood in the way of the news media serving our communities in the best way possible. And we're having sort of that reckoning as well in this industry as it relates to, ideas of objectivity and, sort of this, what does that really mean? And what does it mean to truly comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable? What does it mean it was someone who I heard recently talked about the fact that, facts are the building blocks of truth. And it's important to have news media that is relentless about pursuing and identifying facts as an important part of this movement or this moment that we find ourselves in, because if folks are not informed by facts, it leaves a lot of space out there, I think, for people who maybe don't have the best intentions, as you talked about, to sort of co-opt some of this and to turn it into something that is not going to be useful for us all going forward. So I'll stop and give Mark an opportunity from there, but there's certainly a lot to unpack, I think, as far as the media's role in this space. But number one for me, I think it is being self-reflective and thinking about how we can use our tools, our voice, and our resources to confront misinformation and to make sure that we stand with truth and facts as building blocks, because that's just important.
Well, and as we all know, truth and facts are challenging in this moment when the leader of the free world is so dishonest. The mainstream media has been tracking all of his dishonesty, and I think we're well above 50,000 some odd lives in terms of his tenure. But the landscape has changed. Social media has literally changed everything. I have a producer right now on my show, Make It Plain, LaFontaine and Tiffany, who is really frustrated with social media. And I'm sure when I say this, LaFontaine will appreciate it. We used to be able to produce content and shows and broadcasts, and they could just stand alone, rise or fall, be heard or not. But now it's not just that. You can't just produce a good broadcast. Accompanying that, you have to have a whole nother production team or staff to promote it on social media. It's a whole nother thing. That's good and bad. Of course, the good thing is promotion is good, but let me tell you what's bad about it and what's especially bad about it in this moment of reckoning. Tiffany, you alluded to, some of the historic photographs and images that media were able to share, and that went viral before there was social media. But they also inspired activism. Again, Emmett Till, Black Lives Matter. After Emmett Till in 1955, that sparked what we call the modern day civil rights movement. But what do we have today? We see people marching in the streets, sure. But sometimes social media, I think, does make us a little bit complacent, so that the liking and the sharing and the retweeting becomes a form of activism on its own. And it's really not. Just like the appearance on social media says to some activists, I get 3,000 likes for something I did on social media, and somehow that translates into tangible, scientifically measurable activism, and it really doesn't. And so I lament that sometimes social media can be that type of an intoxicant. For example, we're not going to tweet away police violence. That's going to take, as Dr. King showed, on the ground, hard work, local organizing in some communities where you may not get a lot of media attention. Who cared about Montgomery in 1955? But they didn't come out and say, well, let's start a national movement. They started in one city, and they went city to city to city. And I think social media makes us impatient with that type of work. So while we've seen major marches in many cities, without those marches, and you look beneath the surface, what is taking place on the ground to actually hold people accountable when it comes to police and hold elected officials, some of whom are Black, accountable? All police are governed locally, not nationally. And so you have to vote. That's another thing. Are we encouraging people that elections that are not for the presidency are as important? So when you vote for your city council or your mayor, or even your county commissioner, whatever the electoral structure is in your local jurisdiction, when you vote for those people, you're electing people to have the power to define what the police department does or doesn't do, the power to defund the police department if necessary, and the power to put civilian oversight over the police department. That's as important as voting for the presidency in November. And I think, unfortunately, social media gives us an immediate gratification. Mark and Tiffany and LaFontaine are talking. And that's fine. I mean, that's nice. But at the end of the day, is that just a moment versus a movement that remains sustainable and does real tangible things when the lights and the cameras go away?
No, thank you. Thank you for that perspective. It's I think that actually leads into my next question. We start talking about looping. You're seeing videos over and over and over. And in some spaces, like you said, it is moving some people to actually truly participate in activism in some way. In other places, there's just a conversation that's taking place. But then in other spaces, there's trauma that's taking place, right? And so what my concern is, how do we balance? How do we implement a system that creates some sort of balance where there's not this continuing, ongoing exploitation of Black pain, right? So to constantly see this over and over and revisit the murders of Black people or the degradation of Black people repeatedly, there is this space where sometimes I think that we start moving into a place where some people actually profit from, and it's not our communities, but they profit from that ongoing pain. So what do you all, what are you seeing, and do you think that, how do you call it out, and how can it be stopped, like this profiting from Black pain?
Well, I'll start with that one. That's a very tough call. Because like I said, if the images, just like Emmett Till, if the images of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and Lord have mercy, we don't have any imagery of Breonna Taylor, but left to the imagination is traumatic enough. Without those images being shown in a way that they were, I don't think we would have this reckoning. But then you're right. The trauma that comes from that's one aspect, but here's the other aspect of it, Tiffany. There's also a numbness. And let's face it, the reason we don't often see in the African-American community some of the same outrage when it comes to violent crime in our community is because there's a numbness. We've seen it so much, and it happens so often. We've seen that with mass gun violence in America, with white folk. You shoot up a bunch of babies in a school. All right, that's just what happens in America. So I don't know what the answer to that is yet. And that's one thing that has always troubled me. How do you inform people without succumbing to what is very natural in media, and that's that power of suggestion, where it just becomes routine. Fortunately, the taking of Black lives on the part of law enforcement and armed vigilantes has not become routine. But everyday violent crime, robberies, numb. Mass gun shootings in high schools, numb. People have become to it. That's something that stumps me, honestly, and it's troubling. I don't know what we do about that. And that's where I think, as Dr. King said, we've got to call upon our higher selves. Those of us who are able to resist the numbness. And 9 times out of 10, people who aren't going to get involved in movement aren't going to get involved in movement anyway. But Dr. King talked about the children of darkness versus the children of light. And I think numbness falls in the category of darkness. It just takes those of us who say no. Because, and I think we have to ask ourselves, if I'm numb to this, What would I expect people to do if this happened to my loved one or my child or my husband or my wife? As far as the trauma, yeah, that's real. That's something we've not addressed in the way that we should. I am a part of the National African American Reparations Commission. HR 40, the reparations bill, deals with trauma. That's what we have to do. Some of us are traumatized, don't even know it. But we need even a reckoning on that. And more people are having those conversations so that when people in the C-suite might ask a LaFontaine, well, what should we talk about? What should we do? Well, LaFontaine can say, well, this is one thing we have to address. We have to talk about issues like reparations and trauma. The bill has 160 co-sponsors. The Speaker of the House supports it. That's a big deal. To have the first Speaker of the House, who's not even Black, support a reparations bill. John Lewis supported it. So again, hopefully this is not just a moment and we can continue to have those conversations. I do think, last thing I'll say, obviously there's a deadline, no pun intended, or shall I say a shelf life for some of this imagery, because you don't see the George Floyd video every day like you used to. And I think people said, listen, we don't need to look at this every day. But I will say, in the beginning, it was important that people did see it every day so that people could see it and believe. And like I said, a lot of folks just still do not believe that that happened. If I were a parent of one of those kids at Sandy Hook Elementary, you would have seen my child just like you saw Emmett Till. Now, people didn't want to do that. They thought that was too much. But I feel that if that had been seen at that moment, it would have been impossible not to pass gun violence legislation. If I was with Sister Helen Prejean a few years ago, who's one of the biggest death penalty abolition activists ever, and I said to her, LaFontaine, you know what, if C-SPAN had live coverage of an execution, I bet they'd stop executions. I mean, unfortunately, that trauma sometimes has to be seen. But is it for us seeing it, is it any greater really than the trauma when it actually happens? And that's what we need to figure out a way to stop.
Yeah, so Tiffany, that's a tough one. I don't have an answer there, but what I would do is sort of turn this back and talk about it a little bit through the lens of sort of my role in running a news organization. And actually, before I do that, I would say I am probably one of the few folks who has not watched the George Floyd video. I haven't. I don't plan to. I have no interest in it. And part of that is just because of how I'm wired. I don't take those things very well. And I never, to Mark's point, I never want to get comfortable with death in that way. And so I full disclosure, I've not seen it. Every time I've come close to seeing it, I will step out of a room or whatever. I haven't. But to turn this sort of back around and from the lens of my current role, when you run an organization like the one I do, Mark hit on something, and you did as well in the question, and talking about the trauma. I worry also about the journalists who are out there trying to bear witness, because that's what their role is, and this is how years from now we will be able to recall these events, and it will be through the reporting of some very talented journalists of all colors who are out there having to deal with that trauma, whether it be covering the protests or covering these deaths. And so part of what's important for people in positions like the one I hold is to also make sure that we're doing everything to support those folks, and particularly our journalists of color, because there's a different dynamic there you know, for journalists of color who were either being called to cover these things, or in some cases, being pulled off of covering some of these things because of a perception that perhaps, you know, the color of one's skin will not allow them to quote unquote objectively cover these situations. And so that's one of the other things that I think keeps me up at night and thinking about my role is that trauma, and making sure that you're providing the types of tools and resources for the folks who have to do the very, very tough job of bearing witness. You know, we oftentimes talk about, you know, our first responders who run towards danger when others are running away from it. Well, that's what we ask our journalists to do, and many of our other storytellers and content creators to do, is we actually ask them to run towards it as well, to bear witness for all of us. And there's a lot of trauma in that as well, that I think people in roles like mine have to be conscious of as well.
And if I could just, Tiffany, what LaFontaine is doing is important. I think in this time, what people should learn from in these situations, in terms of how we're portrayed, how we're covered, for once and for all, there should be deference to Black people and people of color in the newsroom. You know, we should be in the room when those decisions are made. Before, that hasn't always happened. But now, if it's a person in LaFontaine's position, if it's a journalist, there should be some deference and input when it comes to how those decisions are made, how they're covered, how often they're covered, what is the language that is being used. I give you one example. And actually, a white opinion writer for the Washington Post has been kind of writing about it. You may have seen LaFontaine, Jennifer Rubin. She's been writing about this. Stop saying that Trump is using racially charged language or racially controversial language. In fact, Associated Press actually did a style piece on it a couple of years ago. But nobody's followed it. She said, stop saying it. Call it racist. Stop trying to clean it up. It's racially charged or racially controversial, or could appear to be. Call it racist. And if you have more people of color and women, whole series of articles this week about how a Black woman VP nominee, Kamala Harris, is too outspoken and too fat. But if you have women in the newsroom, so you can't write that. That's sexist. You don't write articles about an outspoken man, but because she's a woman, you got headlines. That's whoever's in that newsroom, and this came out of Politico, and people are criticizing that. If there were women of color or women of power in their newsroom, they said, no. You can't criticize and do a story that says a woman should not be picked for vice president because she's too powerful and she might overshadow Joe Biden. So obviously, we still have a ways to go to see to it. So like in LaFontaine's case, and don't feel bad, LaFontaine, I know a number of people who haven't seen it. I was on a webinar a few weeks ago, and we were talking about it, and nobody saw it for the reasons you said. They did not want to see it. There were some questions came up, and everybody agreed live on the webinar to look at the video for the first time. Now, let me just say this. What we see is traumatic enough. But I will also say this. We watched it from the very beginning when the police first engaged George. And what is even more traumatic than watching him die is watching the diabolical way they set him up to die. And that's about a 15-minute video, the whole thing. And so for people who've not seen it, that's their choice. But for people who've not even seen it from beginning to the terrible end, you're really missing what happened and what's going on, and how this cop, what it appears, this cop was literally called and asked to come down there. The other police had George in custody, and his other cop shows up and decides to pull him back. If I'm in a police car, I'm in the police car. Why are you going to pull me out of the police car and kill me? So that raises a lot of questions, and further shows that there's a lot more that needs to be done with regards to that investigation, and hopefully it will be. We still don't know really everything that happened in Breonna's apartment. And again, let's get back to women. Now, we have more women in the newsroom than ever before, but LaFontaine used legacy. To me, every legacy mainstream publication every day ought to be publishing a story. Why have Breonna's killers not been arrested? Last week, LaFontaine, you came from Florida. Did you see this? I should have texted to you. You know, Major League Baseball, WNBA has dedicated their whole season to her. The Tampa Bay Rays tweeted on opening day for baseball, and I almost fell off the sofa. This Major League Baseball team, they tweeted, it's opening day for Major League Baseball, and it's also a good day to arrest the killers of Breonna Taylor.
Wow.
It's a Major League Baseball team. So some people are getting it, but there ought to be, if you know, and we know this, the mainstream media decides it's going to get its hooks in something, it's not going to let it go. And why is a Black woman's death not continuing to be in the forefront in the way that it ought to be? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on this long, but.
No, actually, don't be sorry. This is exactly where I want the conversation. I wanted to have all these questions around this. So somebody just mentioned props to the Rays. So thank you for sharing, because some of this information we just didn't have. And I think it's really important to get a very comprehensive overview and scope of the landscape. So often we tend to be very focused, laser focused in one area. But you mentioned something when you talked about Breonna's murder. One of the questions that I have, how do we create these alliances? Because what I find is that oftentimes, as we're talking about the anti-Black racism, the systemic racism that's been built into the very fabric of so many institutions in this country, when it was taken from the indigenous people, when we talk about this, we get sidetracked where people start saying, well, what about Black women? And what about Black men? And what about Black LGBTQ people? And what about Black poor people? Like, this is all a part of the same, because if you are a Black and poor person, there's still different experiences that you have than other people, you know, white people who are poor, right? There's still different systems that you will engage with and how it shows up. And so I'm wondering, how do we work to make these agendas come together where we can kind of galvanize around a few priority areas that impact and benefit all of community? So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, there are a lot of areas that need to be addressed. Right now, I think police violence is the largest priority. And that has even overshadowed what happened to Ahmaud, because that wasn't police, those were ex-police, but it was armed vigilantism like what happened to Terrence Johnson. And so I think that's what needs to happen. And we're seeing there are equal deaths when it comes to Black women and Black men. Whenever in our history as African Americans, we have taken on an issue, everybody else has benefited too. So it's not like focusing on the deaths of Black women and Black men, focusing on Black Lives Matter minimizes the lives of Native Americans who were killed by police, white, mentally ill people. We talk about defund. Folk got to stop calling the police when their loved ones are mentally ill, because the police come and kill them. That's all they know how to do. That happens to white people. It's not like Black Lives Matter harms that movement to end that. It's not like Black Lives Matter harms the movement to end the deaths of LGBTQ people, particularly trans people these days. So I think we can do that one thing. if, as I say, we're disciplined enough to do it locally. The other thing I think in terms of immediate priority is voting. This, not voting or being apathetic toward voting, is costing us our lives every day, be it to the police or being to this administration that is allowing people to die from COVID. And I think if we focus on prioritize those two things, we're 97 days away from election day. And that has to be a priority. And, you know, it may sound selfish because it's something I'm involved in. The conversation is picking up around it, but I think that Black folk need to also finally prioritize reparations, because that is the catch-all for a lot of these issues, including economic empowerment, including getting, or shall I say, bringing some economic parity and ending the racial wealth gap. White folks got reparations where they didn't need them. They got the Homestead Act, they got the FHA loans, they got the GI Bill. We were originally excluded from Social Security. They had all those things to build, which you have in America, wealth is defined by home ownership. That's really all you can own. And we've been locked out of that. And reparations would address that, so that we could have some wealth and undermine the poverty-demic that has been in existence before the pandemic. Poverty-demic predates the pandemic and the police-demic, because the poverty-demic is what causes the pistol-demic, which they then say is black-on-black crime. Again, media have to stop saying that, because white folks kill each other, but it's as if we're the only people in the country that commit crime amongst ourselves. All communities do that. But you don't even solve that problem if you're not creating jobs and wealth and opportunity. And it can't just be a temporary thing. It's gotta be something that is reparational, and what that does is acknowledge the systemic, institutionalized racism that supersedes individual personalities. Yeah, we all got white friends got Black friends, we all get along at work. But when LaFontaine is walking down the hallway of public radio, when he leaves that building, his life is in greater jeopardy than the white folks he walks around and works with every day. So we can all get along and be friends, go out to lunch together. But it's different. That's what I'm saying. When people saw what happened to Ahmaud, they called me to apologize. There are folk, I don't want to say too much. There's some folk who called me yesterday that if I told lie, he just wouldn't believe it. He said, he would probably ask me, they really called you? Because they've never had to really confront this as vividly as it is. And so addressing police violence, organizing locally to do that, organizing people to vote. Oh, let me just say this quickly. And again, tell me if I'm talking too long, Tiffany.
You're not.
Social media. We are targeted as an African-American community on social media to suppress our vote. Russia does that, and they're ramping it up to do again now. And that's one of the conversations I was having yesterday. Some of us who are experts in the cyberspace field, that's why Black people are such genius and beautiful. We have people in the STEM fields who are experts in cyberspace, are preparing to go into cyberspace to begin to filter out the bots and the trolls that are attacking us. It's not just on what millennials use in terms of Instagram and Twitter, but a lot of our older Black generation on Facebook. And all it takes is a couple of trolls to say, we shouldn't vote. Ain't no difference between Biden and Trump, and just plant that. And then a couple of people pick it up, and a couple more people, and a couple more people, and it begins to spread. So that's the other, unfortunately, bad part about social media, that we're targeted in that way. Legacy media has got to cover that and got to talk about that. Not necessarily take a position, but cover that this is what's going on. There is an active corporations boycotting another corporation, that's Facebook, because it won't take some of that stuff down. That's some, I don't know when you've seen that in America. Corporations are pulling their ads off of Facebook because Facebook won't filter that more than it should. They just feel like, so they have all this white supremacy on Facebook, Boogaloo movement and all that, Russian stuff. And major corporations are pulling their ads off of Facebook, which is a major thing. So that's something else that we need to be wary of. And that's why I'm saying voting is important. It is sacred. John Lewis died for it. We can't sit up here and get all teary-eyed about John Lewis and then look somebody on Facebook say this, well, maybe we shouldn't vote. That's cognitive dissonance. And so we have to be vigilant about voting as well.
I will say some of the people have been mentioning in the chat, we have one person that said that this conversation is very emotional, but it's necessary. And they said that we can't have courageous conversations without courage. And so I want to thank you all for having this conversation. And I know we're getting ready, we have a few more minutes to wrap up. I will share with you that I didn't get to all the questions, because to me, this is an ongoing conversation. I call these comma conversations and not period conversations. It doesn't end at this moment. I think there's so much more to talk about. And so I'm hoping that you all will come back at another time to continue more of this conversation. But what I do want to get to, I would like to address, we're nonprofit Prince George's County, right? So we are a very unique county in terms of how we sit demographically. 62% Black, 22% Latinx, 12% white. We geographically are situated right outside of the district, and yet and for all, we are in Maryland, which falls between 1 and 5 in terms of the wealthiest states in the country. And yet and for all, Prince George's County in itself has some of the highest disparities across the board. And then when you look at our neighbors, so Howard, Montgomery, Fairfax County, we have none of the wealth that these counties have, right? So for our nonprofit organizations, what can they do? What do you suggest they should do? And I'll start with LaFontaine and then follow with Mark. What do you suggest they do to make sure that their stories are heard, to make sure that they're lifting up their stories, that they are owning their own stories? Because even with COVID, we didn't just lead the state. We haven't just led the state. We have led the whole Washington metropolitan region in infections, deaths, and now unemployment, right? So what do you have to share for our nonprofit community in terms of how they engage and partner with media, talent, leadership, et cetera?
So I'll try to be brief in addressing this. And this is just a really, really important question, and really important for nonprofit organizations. And to me, it's a two-pronged approach. One is you've got to use the vehicles that are available to tell your own stories. We've all heard the saying, if you let somebody else tell your story, when you hear it again, you may not recognize it. So part of what needs to happen is organizations need to make sure that they are using the tools and resources to be able to tell their own stories themselves. That's one approach. The other approach is to make sure that you are connecting consistently and effectively with local media and local journalism, whether it's your local papers, whether it's your local television or radio broadcast folks, taking advantage of whether they have what we call traditional ascertainment opportunities, where they are looking to make sure that they are talking about the stories that reflect what is going on in the local community. You have got to be on those websites, you've got to be on those email lists, and when those opportunities are out there, you have to avail yourself so that you get in front of not folks like me, but folks like Mark and producers and reporters and editors who are deciding which stories make it to air, or which stories get published in the papers or the magazines. And local media and local journalism are so much more important now, I think, than ever. And you see so many of these voices drying up. But this is where, you know, whether it's stuff going on in a city council meeting or whatever else that are going to have tremendous effects on communities, that you have to have people there doing. So to me, it's a two-pronged approach. One, finding vehicles to tell your own story. And I could talk for an hour on that alone, but then two, making sure you avail yourself and you connect yourself to local news and local journalism and media in the right ways, making sure that, you have the proper news peg for your particular nonprofit organization and a story. So it's almost like you're doing the job of a producer for them by saying, hey, here is who we are. This is what we're doing. This is why it's important. And here's an important news peg, which takes this beyond why it's important to me and my constituents to why it's important to our community to hear about this.
I would just ditto that. And then, of course, not only being sure stories are told and heard, as you said, people need services, and to be made aware of what services are available to them in their local community, as few as they are. Prince George is on the one hand has been held up as the wealthiest Black county in the country, and now it is one that is most ravaged by COVID. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I mean, that is traumatic unto itself. This plague has been traumatic for our people. And I know I sound bipolar when it comes to social media, but it's here and it's here to stay. And so these types of conversations, Tiffany, I would even encourage that more of these happen on social media live, so more people can be engaged and listen and share their thoughts and concerns. This is a legitimate conversation that is going to lead to something, as opposed to what the kids talk about now, clout chasing. But and again, I think what LaFontaine is doing, I mean, thank God that there's still public radio, and we know that even that's in jeopardy. There are those who want public radio to go away. Frankly, there are those, look at this. Legacy, local media newsrooms are going away. Print is just about gone, even print newspapers that are now online. You mentioned the Black press earlier too. I'm involved in trying to help and support the Black press and the National Newspaper Publishers Association. I mean, and they're trying to stay online and be relevant. Anything we can do to support all of these institutions who are going to bring real, truthful information to our communities is what we need, and so we have to support all of them as well. But I want to commend you for doing this, and I've just been reading some of the comments, and there really are some very passionate comments in here. I wish there was a chance to address every single one of them, but I know I speak for Lau when I say we'd be happy to come back, even at a time if we take nothing but questions.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah, really, I'd be happy to do that.
I'm going to ask for another conversation, and it may be a conversation that we need to make it longer than an hour. And so I just need to work with you all on that. So I will be inviting you all back, because I think that our community and the world needs to hear this. And I believe that Prince George's County has the ability, and we should be a model for what racial equity should look like for the world. And so so I stand by that, and that's my vision and my focus and what I'm pushing towards. How can people follow you and stay engaged with what you all are doing, learn more, and even participate in some ways with you all in the work that you're doing in your organization?
On Twitter and Facebook, Make It Plain. On Instagram, Minister with 2 T's. And also have a minister account on Twitter as well, Minister with 2 T's. So either Minister with 2 T's or Make It Plain across social media.
And I'll take that and I'll share that in a follow-up with people who participated in the chat.
And I would just say quickly, while WYPR in Baltimore is not, but PG County is just outside of what we call our protected contour, we absolutely talk about issues that are important to the folks in PG County. There's another wonderful public radio station down that way, WAMU, licensed out of American University as well. But I would encourage folks to give a listen to WYPR as well. Check us out online at WYPR.org. We also launched a podcast called The Daily Dose, which takes a daily look at the state of Maryland's response to COVID, which has been getting lots of really great attention from folks all over the state. So I would encourage folks, wherever you get your podcast, to take a listen to The Daily Dose. We have also been talking about, again, the effects on Prince George's County there. Yeah, you can also find me on Twitter as well. But I would just encourage folks, interact with your local public media, because there are real opportunities there to help make sure that you get your stories told.
Thank you, LaFontaine and Mark. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise. I'm honored to be able to say that I've worked with you all, and I look forward to having another conversation that we can dive a little bit deeper and longer into this discussion, because this is a comma conversation, not a period discussion. Thank you.
We're proud of you too, sister.
Proud of you. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you to all of the nonprofits that are part of the organizations. That the work of nonprofits is often a labor of love. We all know this, and so hats off to you all for what you're doing. And feel free to share my contact information.
Thank you. Take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Good to see you, brother.
All right. Good to see you, man.
All right.